Hello, welcome. Do you have your drink? Please come and take a seat and enjoy a cup of terror with me, Stefanie Valentine. Hello, my spooky little pumpkins. I'm calling everybody pumpkins because I'm currently obsessed with pumpkins and growing pumpkins. If you follow me on my Instagram, you will know what I'm talking about. But if you are coming back, welcome again. Hello again. Thank you for coming back and watching. If you are new here, welcome. Please sit, get cozy, and we will get into today's case. Now, as you know, A Cup of Terror, I do true crime videos that have a little bit of a strange, odd, dark twist to them. And today's case involves vampires. Oh, we've done witches. We've done, what else have we done? I think mainly just witches, isn't it? I don't think I've done any ghosts. Oh God, I can't remember. My memory is so bad. But we've done witches, and today is vampires. Spooky. So, without further ado, let's get into today's case. Before I start today's case, there is a little content warning. This case is a lot more graphic and icky than the other cases I've done so far. There is mention of suicide and blood and some graphic detail. So if those sort of topics aren't for you, then please don't worry about watching this one. And hopefully I will see you at one of my next videos. Okay, so today's case takes place in a village on the Welsh island of Anglesey, which is kind of North Wales. This village is known for having the longest place name in Europe, and I'm not even going to attempt it because it's so bloomin' long, but I will put it on screen now, somewhere here maybe. It's very long. It's sometimes shortened to Llanfair PG. I hope I've said that right, and so I'll refer to it as that throughout the video. So the village is pretty small. There's around 3,000 people living there, and it's a friendly place. It has a lot of elderly people living there. It's pretty quiet, not much happens, and it's a safe place to live, you know, one of the safest places to live in the UK at the time. One of the residents of Llanfair PG was 90-year-old Mabel Leyshon. Mabel was born and raised in Anglesey, I'm able to pronounce that one, a town also in Anglesey. It's about a 10-15 minute drive from there. Mabel was a widow. Her husband, Captain William Leyshon, was the ministry vet for Anglesey. He trained as a doctor and he'd worked at a hospital and then later as a GP. He died in the early 70s, unfortunately, and the couple hadn't had any children. For someone who was 90, Mabel was pretty fit and healthy. She was deaf, she had to wear a hearing aid, and she had cataracts as well, but other than that, she was in good health. She was independent, strong-willed, but she was very polite and also a little reserved. She was very happy and content with life. She would regularly talk on the phone to her friends and also her niece and her cousin. Her niece would sometimes visit, and her cousin would come round to visit maybe once a week. Her cousin, whose name is Beatrice, she talked about how Mabel was quite particular about her appearance. She liked to look smart, she would have her hair regularly done, and she would put lipstick on first thing in the morning. So she was that sort of woman. Other than Beatrice, and then her niece and a couple of other people who would come round, Mabel didn't really have many other regular callers. Mabel sounds really lovely though, really sweet as well. A strong, independent woman who wasn't letting her age get in the way of, you know, living life the way she wanted to. Mabel was a woman of routine, so she'd get up, she'd go to bed, you know, around the same time each day. She'd eat her meals around the same sort of time every day. She was also a talented artist and had many of her sketches and drawings around her house. And she had lived in that house for over 50 years, so quite a long time. So it was around 12:30 p.m. on Sunday the 25th of November 2001. Mabel would regularly get a meal delivered from Meals on Wheels. Meals on Wheels is a program, a scheme that delivers meals to people who aren't able to maybe purchase or prepare their own meals. A volunteer comes round with the food and it just needs to be popped into the oven or the microwave to be heated up. The volunteer knocked on Mabel's door, but there was no answer. They weren't too concerned at this point though, because they knew that Mabel wore a hearing aid and she was deaf and she would most likely be watching television. So there was a high chance that Mabel wouldn't hear the knock. The volunteer continued knocking and then she decided to try knocking on the back door, see if she could get Mabel's attention that way. So she went round to the back of the house and that's when she saw that one of the glass panels in the door had been smashed. So she calls the police, explains the situation, and officers were sent to investigate. They tried knocking as well, just in case, and once again though, no answer. They went round to the back of the house and one of the officers, Alison Hughes, she squeezed through the window, got into the house, and she started walking through, just kind of checking it out. She eventually got to the living room where the curtains were drawn and there was a reddish orange glow emanating from the room, from the fire. She noticed someone sitting in a chair with a blanket over them, and this blanket had been pulled up right over her body and her head. Alison wasn't sure if the person was sleeping or injured perhaps, so she started pulling the blanket down, and there was Mabel, dead. The officer continued pulling the blanket off Mabel, and that's when she discovered that Mabel's death wasn't natural, it was actually a horrible, brutal murder. So more police were called out to the scene, the house was cordoned off, and an investigation was launched. The forensics team and the pathologist, Dr. Brian Rogers, they started trying to figure out the cause of death. The first thing they noticed was the actual crime scene, the living room. At her feet were two brass pokers positioned in the shape of a crucifix. There was also a couple of candlesticks on the floor close to the body. They pulled the blanket off Mabel completely, and the pathologist was shocked. Mabel had been stabbed multiple times, mainly in the chest and neck area. In fact, she'd been stabbed 22 times and there were many wounds on her hands and her forearms where Mabel had tried to defend herself from this attack. And that was just the beginning of what they discovered. She had a massive open wound in her chest. Her breastbone had been almost kind of split apart completely from her chest down to the top of her abdomen. Can't say that word. Her heart had been ripped from her chest, and at Mabel's feet they found a little round saucepan which had been placed on a silver platter, and inside they found something wrapped in several layers of newspaper and it was soaked in blood. The pathologist didn't want to open it just yet for fear of destroying any kind of vital evidence on there, but he had a pretty good idea of what was in it. Another strange detail was that, considering what had happened, multiple stabbings, this wound, there wasn't a whole lot of blood at the scene. The whole scene in front of them was so odd, so bizarre, and so ritualistic. Dr. Rogers actually said that this crime scene was one of the worst he had ever seen. So the forensics team quickly got to work, hoping to find some sort of evidence that could help. There were no fingerprints found at the scene, so the murderer must have worn gloves. They did find a couple of shoe prints, and they also found a smear of blood by the back door. It's likely that it was Mabel's blood, but it was by the broken window, so they were hoping that there was a chance that the killer had maybe cut themselves and left a little bit of blood, for them to find. At the autopsy, they finally unwrapped the newspaper, and as expected, it was Mabel's heart. The tip of the heart had been cut off, thought to have been done to allow the killer to squeeze the heart of blood and completely drain it. They also discovered big cuts at the back of Mabel's legs and her inner elbow at the site of where major blood vessels would be. These cuts were done after death, and once again they think it was done to drain Mabel's body of her blood. The killer, after stabbing Mabel to death, had drained her of her blood. This case was becoming more and more bizarre. Coupled with the pokers in the shape of a cross and the scene in the living room, police came to the conclusion that perhaps it had something to do with the occult. Was this some sort of ritual or sacrifice? Nothing had been taken, so it wasn't a robbery. They were pretty sure of that. So an investigation was launched. The police realised just how shocking this crime was, and in particular the details such as the heart being ripped out and the ritualistic aspect of the crime scene. So they decided to keep those sorts of details away from the public. You know, no need to mention it and panic the community just yet. The police started with some house-to-house inquiries, just asking if anybody had seen anything or they knew anything, but unfortunately nothing came of it. A police profiler was brought in and they came up with a criminal profile. They thought that they needed to look for a male between the ages of 18 and 60 years old, living alone or living with parents, and anybody who had previous contact with the victim, obviously. They also thought that the killer was suffering from some sort of delusion or had a personality disorder. The results from a bloodstain eventually came back, and it was found that it was a partial DNA profile and that it belonged to a male. So the police tested every man in the area who fitted this age range, but unfortunately there was no match. 9 days after the murder, the police had their first suspect. There had been a suicide on Britannia Bridge, which links Anglesey to the mainland of Wales, and a body had been found. 37-year-old David Griffiths. He had poured petrol on himself and he'd set himself alight before jumping off the bridge. He had died of smoke inhalation and multiple injuries. So police went up to the top of the bridge, and there in the bridge they find crosses scratched into it. So they wondered if this could be a connection to the crosses found at Mabel's house. The close proximity to the crime scene, the nature of his death, the scratches, meant that the police decided to look into David Griffiths as a possible suspect in the case. At first, they were quite convinced that Griffiths was the perpetrator. The police profiler in particular, he was convinced that David was their man. However, you can't argue with the evidence. They couldn't find anything to link Griffiths with Mabel or her home, and Griffiths' DNA didn't match, the DNA found at the scene, and he was ruled out as a suspect. Can you imagine what it was like for his family though? Like, first of all, they had to deal with David's death and the pain of losing him, and then they find out that he was being looked into as a suspect in this very brutal murder. I mean, I feel really sorry for them. Like, I guess the police have to look into it and look into this lead just in case, but it's such an awful set of circumstances. So the police were getting nowhere in this case. They had no matches to the DNA, no one had seen anything, no one was coming forward with information. So they turned their attention to one of the footprints found at the scene. They trawled through thousands of shoes to find a matching pattern, and eventually they did. They found a match to a pair of Levi trainers. Now, luckily for the police, these trainers didn't sell well. They weren't too popular and they were taken out of production, so only 52 pairs were sold in the area. This was looking like their most promising lead so far. They went through the list of purchases made, most of them by card, which were easy to trace, and a few by cash. Once again though, another dead end. The forensics team were still hard at work, and they ended up with a rather gruesome discovery. They were examining the little milk pan that had Mabel's heart and blood in it, and they found a lip imprint on the lip of the pan. Whoever had murdered Mabel and cut out her heart had also seemingly drank her blood. Were they looking for a vampire? Is that why Mabel had those cuts behind her legs and elbows? Were they draining her of her blood in order to drink it? I mean, it could explain why there wasn't a lot of blood at the scene. So, a month after the brutal murder of Mabel Leyshon, the police were no further forward in the investigation. You know, the residents of the village, they were terrified, understandably. Many of them were also elderly, like Mabel. At first, police were keeping the full details of the murder quiet. They didn't want to panic the villagers too much, but unfortunately, some of the details were leaked. Fear and alarm just rippled through the village. People were understandably even more terrified now, and the rumours going around weren't exactly helping. For example, there was a rumour that said that Mabel's intestines were stretched out around the room, and that there were vampires out there ready to strike again. There were rumours that it might have been a cult, or that witchcraft was involved. There were so many rumours flying around and so much fear that the police ended up having to give out all the details for the crime. And they decided to do this by doing a reconstruction for Crime Watch, which was a show that used to show reconstructions of unsolved crimes, you know, in order to get information from the public which may help the case. They would encourage the public to call in if they thought they had any kind of information that could help any of the cases shown on the show. I don't think the programme is still shown on telly. I haven't seen it for a while, so I don't think it is. Thankfully, there were hundreds of calls, but one stuck out in particular to the police. 3 art students were partying. There was drinking and drugs. One of the boys there was chatting to one of the other partygoers for a little while, a 16-year-old exchange student from Germany. Now, this boy was going on about vampires, about how he fantasized about becoming a vampire and being immortal. He told the German exchange student that this village was perfect for vampires because there was a lot of elderly people and no one would be suspicious if they died. They just assumed that it was a natural death, like a heart attack, for example. So he asked this girl to bite him on the neck because he believed that she was a vampire and that she had the power to turn him into one. So he pushed his neck into her teeth, and she was obviously weirded out by this and she refused. And he got aggressive and he pushed her onto the bed and he tried to force her to bite him. He continued being very aggressive and violent and had to be restrained and dragged away by the third friend and the landlady of the place that they were at. At one point, he punched himself in the nose, he made himself bleed, and then he asked them to smell his blood. All right, weirdo. The police were called out and the boy even asked one of the police officers to bite his neck. And the boy was taken to the police station. They just kind of kept him there overnight and they let him go the next day. So the other student, the third one, the one who helped restrain this boy, he had watched the Crime Watch reconstruction. He had heard the details about the blood draining and the drinking and the potential links to cultism and vampires, and he made the link. And thankfully, he contacted the police with all of this information. The boy that the police looked into was 17-year-old Matthew Hardman, who also lived in the village. Matthew was born in, and I hope I'm saying this right, Amloch. I'll put it on the screen, just in case I've said it completely wrong, which I probably have. It's on the north coast of Anglesey. His mother and her partner moved to Llanfair PG in '98 when he was 13 years old. His father, who was separated from his mother, he died that same year, sadly, from a massive asthma attack, and this obviously affected him badly. He was said to be well behaved at school, pleasant and polite, quite reserved though, not very sociable, but there was nothing out of the ordinary about him. You know, he was an art student and he was studying art and design at college. He liked the usual sort of things that teenagers like, you know, like music, telly, gaming, drinking with friends. He seemed very normal. The thing is, the police had actually spoken to Matthew during the investigation, but his DNA wasn't taken because he was 17. And due to this police profile, They were looking at men between the ages of 18 and 60, so they just missed him. He also had an alibi. He claimed that his parents were away that night and he was with a friend all night. So police started looking into him. They weren't really considering him as a suspect, but they had to follow up on the lead, obviously. They went to his college and they found paintings that were violent and dark. There was one in particular showing an angel with a rib cage that was exposed and open. But they didn't think too much of this, they thought it was kind of that typical teenager thing, with a dark subject matter for his art. They paid him a visit anyway, just to check him out, asking him about the incident with the German student. And, he said, sorry, I got a little out of control. I didn't mean to scare her. Okay. They asked her about Mabel, they asked him about Mabel, and he claimed to not know her. But his mother, who was there, corrected him, saying, actually, you do know her. You were her paper boy for ages. Why was he lying about this detail? Who knows? The officers asked to see more of his art, which was same sort of thing that they'd seen at the college. When they were in his room, though, something caught the eye of one of the officers. Matthew had a pair of Levi trainers, the exact same style as the print that was found at the murder scene. So they took the trainers away to be examined. Police looked more into Matthew's alibi and they discovered that the person that he said he was with the night of the murder was the same student who called in to the police about Matthew. So they spoke to this student and he said, no, I wasn't with Matthew that night. Nope. So he was lying about his alibi. Matthew is looking more and more suspicious by the minute. Forensics came back regarding the shoes. Not only was the pattern the same, the size was a match too. So Matthew was arrested the next morning on January the 8th, 2002 on suspicion of murder. They started interviewing him and that's when he admitted that, oh yeah, I do know Mabel. Yeah, I chatted to her a few times. While he was being interviewed though, his house and bedroom were being searched. And in one of his coat pockets, they found a knife. And they also discovered that Matthew had quite a dark and morbid interest. There were a lot of books on vampires and the occult. They asked Matthew about this and he admitted to being interested in vampires and he admitted to looking up quite kind of gruesome things on the internet, but yeah, it wasn't anything more than just an interest, nothing serious. In fact, quite the opposite was true. He didn't have an interest in vampires, he had an obsession with them. He was convinced that vampires exist and he was particularly fixated on the belief that they were immortal. So the police searched his computer and they found many searches for vampires and violence, Satanism, how to conduct a black mass, that sort of thing. So a DNA sample was taken and the results soon came back. It was only a partial DNA sample found at the scene and quite a weak match, but it was enough for the police. He was a match to the DNA found at the scene. The knife that was found in Matthew's pocket was tested and they found a tiny trace of blood on it. Not only was his DNA found on it, Mabel's DNA was also found on the knife. So even though Matthew was refusing to admit to anything and claiming that he was completely innocent, the police decided that they had enough evidence and they charged him with the murder of Mabel Leyshon. Many of the people in the village couldn't believe this. Matthew seemed so nice and so normal, and that's the thing. I think many people forget that murderers aren't some sort of obvious, scary looking monster like they're often portrayed in movies. They look just like our neighbours, our colleagues, our friends. They look like you and me, normal. So Matthew's trial took place on July 2002. The prosecution claimed that Mabel was targeted because he knew that she didn't get a lot of visitors, she lived alone, she was deaf. So he waited until his parents were away and he put his plan into motion. He was determined to become a vampire, and this killing would be the sacrifice that he was going to offer up. He snuck round to the back of the bungalow and he broke in, and as Mabel was watching telly, he crept up behind her and he launched into the attack, stabbing her 22 times. Mabel tried to fight back, but unfortunately he overpowered her. Once she was dead, he sat her in the chair and he started with his ritual. He laid the pokers and the candlesticks on the floor in the shape of a cross, and he started draining her of her blood into one of the saucepans. To get the maximum amount of blood, he tore open her chest and he cut out her heart, squeezing as much blood out of it as he could. And then, to complete this ritual sacrifice, which he believed would grant him immortality by turning him into a vampire, he drank her blood. It's believed that the crosses on the floor were to test whether he'd successfully transformed into a vampire. And I have a feeling that nothing happened. You know, the cross didn't affect him, it didn't burn him or anything like that. He wrapped the heart in the newspaper and left it in the pan, covered Mabel with a blanket, and then he left the scene of the crime. The trial took place over 3 weeks. Matthew was calm and composed during the trial, and he was still claiming innocence. There was too much evidence though, and on the 2nd of August 2002, Matthew Hardman was found guilty for the murder of Mabel Leyshon and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 12 years. 20 years on and he's still in prison, still claiming that he's completely innocent, but it doesn't look like he's going to be released anytime soon though. So before I end this video, I should mention that just because somebody might have an interest in these subjects doesn't mean that they're going to go out there and kill someone. I mean, I think most teenagers have that period in their life when, yeah, they're kind of interested in those sort of darker subject matters, shall we say. I know I was. I still am, to be fair. And I myself was kind of obsessed with vampires, and I haven't killed anyone yet. So I say yet. I shouldn't have said yet, should I? I haven't killed anyone. I'm not going to. So we should just, not assume that just because you're into these sort of things doesn't mean that you're going to go out there and murder someone. So that's today's case. The horrible, horrible murder of a sweet old lady by a child. I mean, technically he was a child and he had delusions of vampires. I remember hearing about this at the time, actually. I think I was only about 13, and I remember it freaked me out. I was so creeped out, and it still creeps me out as an adult, It's such a horrible, horrible case. This sweet old lady just living her life, and this boy just coming along and brutally murdering her. So that's today's case. Like I said, a little more gruesome and intense than my usual cases, but it had vampires, not real ones, but it involved some sort of vampirism. So definitely a very interesting case, and I definitely wanted to talk about this one. So that is today's case. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Thank you so much for your support, and well, I shall see you next week for the next Cup of Terror.